about a fall day, so almost 7 years ago. So it was October of 2012 when I was traveling to the U.S.-Mexico border as part of a study trip when I was in seminary. For those that are familiar, seminary is like graduate school for pastors. So part of the study trip in seminary where we went down to the U.S.-Mexico border. So we flew into Tucson from Colorado, and it was just a few months after my daughter Lexi was born. Lexi's my first child. And I was taking part in this experiential week-long learning program called Border Links. So it's this program down in Tucson which explores kind of the difficulties of migration and life along the U.S.-Mexico border. So we do a lot of different things while we're there. We walked along the migrant trails in the desert. We witnessed migration-related court proceedings. We visited shelters. We went to detention centers. I mean, we kind of did it all. Just kind of exploring everything and all the things that go along around the border and those issues related. And even more so, we went across the border and stayed in Nogales, Mexico. I think I'm saying that right. Nogales or something like that anyway. We spent the night in a shelter in Mexico. And in Nogales, where we spent the night, we spent the night at this, it was adequate but a bit rustic, I guess I'd say. We had these compostable toilets, which I was not a big fan of. But it was adequate nonetheless. And the thing we were told to be most wary of, if you can imagine, was not to drink the water, right? So, we were strongly advised, don't drink any water under any circumstance unless it's bottled or, like in a Coca-Cola or something. So I'd done real well all day drinking my bottled water or water I brought from Arizona. But as I got ready for bed that night, and I fell into my nighttime routine, I let my guard down a little bit. And I wet my toothbrush with water from the tap before brushing my teeth. Who doesn't do that, right? Yeah. So, I was like, oops. And then I tried to rinse it off with some bottled water, and I just kind of brushed my teeth, thinking nothing of it, hoping nothing would be wrong. And it was only a little bit of water. I thought, can't be that big of a deal. And a day and a half later, I found out it could be kind of a big deal, right? Now, in hindsight, it wasn't really all that bad, but certainly in the moment, it was not a lot of fun. So we went back to the United States side of the border, and around, I think, like I said, it was like a day and a half later, maybe a day later that was. I went to bed early. I was just not feeling well in my stomach, and my stomach was just grumbling and growling. I was feeling miserable all over. So I went to bed sometime early in the evening. I was just tossing and turning all through the evening. And as things would happen, that same night, I'm pretty sure it was, Karina called me and said, "Hey, Lexi's not feeling well." Again, Lexi, our 2.5-month-old daughter at the time. Lexi's not feeling well, and I think you took her to urgent care. So I was like, oh boy, that's great. So it's probably an hour later, I get another call from Karina from the urgent care to say, hey, they're worried about Lexi's oxygenation levels, and they're taking her by ambulance all the way to Children's Hospital, somewhere from Broomfield all the way to Children's Hospital. So here I am laying in bed, feeling just miserable, and I thinking to myself, oh boy, this could be a serious problem. And here I am feeling miserable. I might have to figure out a way to get myself up, get myself dressed, and somehow get myself packed up and to the airport when I'm feeling like I might, Now, fortunately, as things would have it, Lexi was actually treated and released, I think, after just a few hours, and I fell asleep shortly, I want to say around midnight. So I woke up sometime the next morning, still feeling pretty yucky, the technical term for the word, right? And even though I was back in the U.S., the study trip wasn't over. We were actually going to meet that morning with a couple of young undocumented migrants who were students, high school students in the area, and lived and went to school nearby. So as As the meeting began, I kind of made my way gingerly into the room, and I sat down, begrudging the fact that I was going to sit here through this meeting when I was still feeling pretty terrible. And as I sat there, these two teenage boys began to kind of talk about their situation. How they'd come to America as two, young kids, young boys, probably 2 or 3 years old, I think they'd said, with their parents, but without, proper documentation. And they were now trying to finish high school and then figure out a way to go to college without any kind of real documentation or legal status in the country. And of course, they were doing all this and trying to make all these goals and aspirations for their education and for their career under the umbrella of realizing that at any moment, at any time, they could be caught, captured, whatever the word we want to use, and sent back to Mexico because of their undocumented status, having to leave the only home they've known, really their entire life. But as I sat there, with my stomach growling and my head spinning, I thought to myself, who cares? Cry me a river. I've got my own problems to deal with. I still feel terrible. My infant daughter was just in the hospital last night. Why should I care about your problems when I've got my own problems to deal with? Not exactly the most compassionate response, right, from someone training to be a pastor. But there I was. And maybe it's just so I feel less guilty, but it's a situation we've all found ourselves in, perhaps, at one time or another. We hear about children suffering from hunger, families struggling to get by, people facing discrimination and oppression, and perhaps we think to ourselves, no, that's too bad, and we leave it at that. I mean, it's not that we think it's right, it's not that we're necessarily indifferent or don't care. It's just like me sitting there 7 years ago, we think to ourselves, I got plenty enough problems to deal with on my own. I can't handle dealing with your problem too. And as callous, as uncaring as that sounds, that it is callous and uncaring. In some sense, there is some real truth to that, right? I mean, unless you're rich and famous, this is just a hard time, I feel like, to live in America. I mean, whether you're single, whether you're in a relationship, whether you have a family, housing seems like it's practically unaffordable. Healthcare costs are obscene, and there's so many people who have student loan debt or other forms of debt that just seem crushing. So probably like me, you're not like, it's not like you're antagonistic toward immigrants. You're not okay with racism and prejudice. You're not even okay. You don't like seeing the real life struggles of LGBT plus persons. That's just like, man, you're trying to pay the rent. You're trying to figure out how to pay your medical bills. And your kids are just struggling to get by in school. And it's just, what else can you do? So it's not that we don't care. It's not that we're okay with these things. It's just that we feel like we don't have the time or the energy to deal with these things because we've got so much to deal with on our own. And every hour, every minute, it feels like every second that we don't spend worrying about our own problems is a minute or second or hour lost to taking care of our own struggles or our own family struggles. And if we don't take care of us, who will? In many ways, we're kind of taught that life is this inherent zero-sum game. Zero-sum kind of means like, there's one winner and everyone else is going to be a loser. It's kind of like we're in this massive game of capture the flag. Has anyone ever played capture the flag? Usually in capture the flag, there's two teams and they're all trying to go for each other's flag, and whoever gets the opposing flag wins. It feels like in life though right now that we're all in this massive game of capture the flag, except we're all on our own individual teams, all going after this one singular flag, trying to find, trying to win for ourselves and fend off everyone else in the process, trying to find health, happiness, and, and good fortune for ourselves. So it's not that we don't care about other people. It's like we can't care about the undocumented immigrant. We can't, because if we do care for these people, like my own daughter, my own family will lose ground. And yeah, we don't like it. We don't like things the way they are, but that just feels like that's the way they are. What else are we to do? What else can we do? So several years ago, there was a pastor who kept running into these same issues himself. William Barber is his name, and he was at the time, and is still actually now. He was a pastor of this church called Greenleaf Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, which is actually a sister church of ours in this network of churches we're part of called the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. And if you're wondering, well, what does that mean? Well, let me tell you. We're in the midst of a series called Your Story, Our Story, in which we're looking at some of the ways our individual stories fit into the broader story of this network of churches we're in called the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And throughout this series, we're trying to highlight some of the ways the issues we care about fit into these broader issues that make up our broader church group, issues like inclusion, welcome, justice, and unity that are important to other people in churches just like ours. So William Barber was an African-American pastor who grew up in the South, kind of the post-civil rights area of the South, in a family that was very committed to equality and opportunity equality for folks in the United States. So growing up, he was so committed to trying to help people achieve a better life. He actually went to school, he went to college to become a lawyer. But it was while he was in college that the words of the Old Testament prophet Micah began to stir in his heart and direct him down a different path. So the words of Micah 6:8, and I'm going to read them from the Message. It's a little simplistic translation, but I think it kind of gets the point across in a way that's really understandable. So Micah 6:8 says, He's already made it plain how to live, what to do, what God is looking for in men and women. It's quite simple. Do what is fair and just to your neighbor, be compassionate and loyal in your love, and don't take yourself too seriously. Take God seriously. Perhaps you've heard it another way. When I was growing up, I heard it in the King James Version, which was, what does God require of you? Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Those were the words that spoke deeply to William Barber when he was in college, and then words of that Old Testament prophet Micah. Now I want to take a minute just real quick to explain. When we think of the word prophet today, we often think of someone like a fortune teller or someone who can predict the future. That wasn't quite an accurate description of what an Old Testament prophet was. I like to think about it kind of in terms like a meteorologist, someone who predicts the weather. A meteorologist, they'll kind of gather the data, gather the facts, look back in previous trends and kind of make a prediction about what's going to happen in the future, kind of based on all the facts that they've gathered. In many ways, I think this was kind of the role of an Old Testament prophet. They'd kind of look at what's happening in their nation, they kind of see what might be coming on the horizon, and they kind of say, like, hey, we need to do something different, we need to change, or else some bad things are going to happen. And Micah was an Old Testament prophet. He said, hey, we've got to do things different. We've got to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. He spoke this to his people. So this is what William Barber began to do. As a pastor, he began working for fairness and equality in the neighborhood in which he worked to spread God's compassion and love to all his neighbors and to all those in need. But one thing Pastor Barber repeatedly noticed as he tried to bring neighbors and neighborhoods together to support one another is that people had different issues that were important to them, but they were reticent to support each other's concerns in fear that they themselves would lose ground or get left behind. So at one meeting, Pastor Barber gathered some of the key neighborhood leaders, and he asked them to write down all the various issues that people were struggling with. From food insecurity to affordable housing to fair pay, so on and so forth. But interestingly, they didn't stop there. These leaders also began to write down all the forces, that's the word they used, all the forces that stood in the way of these things. And interestingly enough, they found that it was these same forces that were opposing all these issues. These leaders began to realize that the same forces that were working against families finding affordable housing, adequate health care, and quality education were the same forces that were fighting against equal opportunities for LGBT persons, spreading racism and prejudice, and stoking fear of migrants. Now, in Christianity, historically, we've called these forces evil, and when it personified the devil. And whether or not we believe in a literal Satan or understand evil as systemic and structural, I think we can agree that there are forces, there are powers, there are principalities, as the Apostle Paul used, that seek to thwart the radical, expansive good news of God made known in Jesus. I remember, perhaps you've read this before, 1 Peter 5:8. Keep alert. Like a roaring lion, your adversary, the devil, prowls around looking for someone to devour. The Apostle Paul wrote in Ephesians 6:12, for our struggle is not against the enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. We're not competing with one another. We're not competing with one another. That is, if I can say, it's a lie of the devil. We're competing with forces that seek us to bring us down, to seek to bring every single one of us down. So what can we do? The good news is that the one we follow, the one we worship, came to defeat the powers of evil and set us free from all those who would seek to bind and oppress us. I feel like in William Barber's church, that's where we say, can I get an amen? Right? The good news is that the one we follow, the one we worship, came to defeat the powers of evil that seeks to destroy and oppress us, and to set us free from those. That's good news. Jesus himself announced in Luke chapter 4 that he had come to bring good news. I remember the story from Luke chapter 4. He enters the temple and he reads, they had in the ancient temple system, they'd have a time where or a synagogue, in the synagogue, they'd have a time where they'd read from their ancient text, just kind of like we do today. And their ancient text was a text we know as Isaiah. And he read from that text then. And he's unrolled the scroll, Luke chapter 4, verse 17, and then we're going to start at 18. He unrolled the scroll for the prophet Isaiah that was handed to him. He unrolled it and he began to read where it was written. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then he did something pretty interesting. He set the scroll down, rolled it up, gave it back to the attendant, sat down, and everybody was watching him. All the eyes of the synagogue were on him. And he said to them, today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. I mean, whoa, it's like a mic drop right there, right? Today, these words have been fulfilled in your hearing. Wow. As a church, As the community of Jesus followers on earth, we're to be a living example of God's love and God's justice, what that can mean for all people. I mean, the sad reality, though, is that we often fall short. Christianity is often a self-serving religion meant to benefit us without really showing any real regard to the real-life struggles of others. But the thing is, this kind of self-serving Christianity, this kind of self-centered church, really only serves to maintain the status quo. Because think about it. Because if I'm only worried about myself, my own issues, my own relationship with God, only me, I can't ever think about someone else's issues, your issues. But here's the thing. I believe we can't ever find true freedom. Theologically, we might say true salvation, if our neighbor is still struggling, still facing discrimination, still being rejected. When we come together as a church, as a community of faith, we do so supporting one another, lifting up each other's real life struggles and challenges, seeking to show compassionate love to everyone. Understanding that the same forces that seek to hurt us are the same forces that are seeking to hurt our neighbor. But in following the way of Jesus, we bring God's love and justice for all people. So our task, first and foremost, is to listen and then to love. We cannot know each other's pain and suffering until we listen to one another. We can't know each other's struggles and the things we have in common until we understand the stories and struggles of our neighbors. But when we take a moment to listen, I think we'll find our struggles in their struggles, our pain in their pain, our hope in their hope, our freedom in their freedom. And we'll love in God's love. You know, as I sat there 7 years ago almost, my stomach was churning, my head was fuzzy. I was thinking about my daughter. And I started to listen. I started to listen to these young men. And I heard, or I began to hear in their struggles, my own struggles. And the words of Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King came to mind. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable web of mutuality, tied to a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. My daughter, my son, my family. We will never find health and happiness and success until these students find health and happiness and opportunity. So the choice that I faced those 7 years ago in that room is a choice that we each face every single day of our lives. We can turn our heads and ignore the real life struggles of others. We can live us against the world, each in our own silos, everyone on their own, divided. We can live in fear and suspicion. You know, everyone is out to get us. Everyone's my enemy. Everyone's my competitor. You know, it's a zero-sum game. Everyone is looking out for themselves. Let's build us a castle. Let's stockpile us some food, and let's be prepared to defend at all costs. That's one possibility. Or we can open our hearts to listen to the stories of others, coming together in support of our shared struggles, our shared mutuality, our shared shared humanity, seeking to live God's love and God's justice, if even in some small way. And really, the choice is up to us. Which sounds better? And maybe more, what is really the way of Jesus? You know, here together as a church, as a small community of faith, we can live into God's love and God's welcome and God's inclusion, and welcoming everyone, sharing readily, and spreading God's love and justice for all. The choice is yours and mine. To live in fear and division, or to act in God's love and mutuality. I believe that when we open our hearts and listen, really it's what it's about, is opening our hearts, we'll find community and we'll find love. And I pray that this will be a place where we can find